I should think that the legacy is almost as huge as the Great War itself.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons that our centre was set up. There are 5 of these centres nationally, and we're funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, working in close partnership with the Heritage Lottery Fund, to work with groups who are interested in the legacy of the First World War. Lots of groups are interested in what happened in that 4 years, but as you said, lots of them are interested in the impact of the war afterwards.
How important was it that you were interested in that period of history?
Not essential, I don't think. I do have an interest in the sort of years before. I did a project on the suffrage campaign in Birmingham. My sort of previous studies were more on 19th century Britain, but it's been quite a nice sort of learning curve for me. I've learned a lot, particularly about Birmingham and the Midlands during the First World War, and lots of other things around that topic.
Because something like this, I mean, it was not called the Great War for nothing. It was a massive thing. It was a global thing. So if you're trying to pin it down to one area and one city, how difficult was it to find all that out?
It is difficult. We have themes that we look at, so we've broken it down even further. So we look at cities at war, so Birmingham, but we could look at other cities as well and compare what was happening there to Birmingham. We're also looking at gender on the home front, so women, what was happening to them, children's experience of war, commemoration more widely, and also belief as well, so we break it down a bit further.
I must say that one of the things in my fairly cursory research on this showed me that it was a war in which suddenly the role of the women at home came very much to the fore. They became, I mean, they were key to the war effort. You hear so much in the Second World War, don't you, about women and the war effort at home and things, but this all started way back, didn't it?
Well, I mean, you did have lots of women working in factories prior to the First World War, so it's not that women all of a sudden were working. There were lots of working class women, of course, who'd worked in factories and things. But yes, because of the sheer volume and the numbers of men who went to fight, more and more women had to work, primarily in this area, in munitions factories. But also there was a women's land army, lots of women went into nursing as well. So yeah, so you see that, you know, you sort of have the suffrage campaign leading up to that time, and then the war happens and obviously women have to or take on more responsibilities and become a bit more independent.
And was it still fairly difficult? Because as you say, I mean, the suffragette movement was not that long before then, was it? I mean, it was a huge change in society, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the years leading up to the First World War were very turbulent. There was lots of change happening. You had things like things that were happening in Ireland at the same time as the suffrage campaign. So yeah, it's a period of very sort of political turmoil, definitely.
I suppose one of the things you would have probably found out over the period of this research and putting this exhibition together was the fact that the letters that people wrote, that the diaries that people wrote, I mean, that must have been terrific stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. There have been lots of projects about letters and diaries. Yeah, absolutely. And they're very sort of personal accounts of what's happening. And also the letters strike you often as being very mundane. So the soldiers are sort of limited on what they can write because they'll be censored. So it's you know, they're asking for the next door neighbour and, you know, what have you been up to? And then people write back, well, I went to the picture. You know, it's just day-to-day life carries on in some form or another, and that's quite striking when you read that. When you realise, you think what's happening around them as they're writing these letters. It's very effective. Did
some of these letters, either that were written to families back home or that people kept a diary of, did they give you any fresh insight into things?
I think just, yeah, the kind of everyday life, you know, when you read letters back from soldiers, what it was like in the trenches. Yeah, I think that's, you sort of think of it as being such a long time ago and you sort of lose touch with it a little bit, but then you realise when you read letters and diaries how, you know, they're just like us.
And for everybody, I mean, the struggle, both ends of this spectrum, were massive, weren't they?
Yes, absolutely, yeah. There was lots of problems initially when the war started. You know, food prices went up. Lots of factories shut down in sort of panic at what was going to happen with the war. So there was initially a lot of problems financially for people. Then you have the war stretching on, you know, for a long period of time, much longer than people expected. So yeah, it's a very hard 4 years.
Because it can't be forgotten as well. I mean, the death toll, the slaughter during that First World War at times was just you can't really begin to envisage.
Yes, yeah, it is. Yeah, the figures are horrendous, and when you realise the kind of weapons that were being used, you know, the introduction of tanks and all these new weapons that were being used had such an enormous impact. But the statistics are that only about 20% of soldiers who enlisted didn't come back. So you have a huge number who did come back, many of them with injuries, serious mental and physical injuries. So there's that legacy of it as well. You know, how did they come back and how did they get back to normal life?
Yeah, you talk about the mental suffering that people suffered. I don't suppose at that time we looked at it in quite the way we do now. We talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, don't we?
Absolutely.
But I don't imagine they did then, did they?
I think when you read, there was a kind of lack of, perhaps not sympathy, but understanding, certainly. You know, they hadn't seen conflict like this. They probably hadn't recognised, the sheer numbers of people who came back with some sort of trauma. So I think it was a lack of understanding of what was happening.
Voices of the war. Are there many actual voices available? I mean, can we actually hear people from that era?
We can, yes. Actually, Birmingham Museum has a fantastic collection of oral histories that were recorded, I think, in the 60s of people who were around at that time. And as we were talking about women earlier, there's one particularly that I've heard of a woman who worked in a munitions factory called Edith Pittaway, I think. And she talks about how the girl's skin started to turn yellow because of the TNT. They didn't realise that this would be one of the effects. So often the girls would be called canary girls. And she talks about an accident an inspector has where I think it's with a grenade and she damages part of her finger, so it sort of gives you a bit of an insight into the lack of health and safety at the time.
I was going to say, there wasn't health and safety then, was there? If there was, I suspect a lot of things would not have happened. No. Because at that time, if you're going back a few years and you're getting recordings of people from then, to some people those memories would have been pretty vivid still.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. And as I say, there's a huge collection actually at the museum. I think some of them are online, or you can probably access them in the museum itself. But hugely valuable, because obviously now there isn't anybody around that can talk about the First World War that was there, so these recordings are very important. I'm sure there are other ones nationally as well, but for Birmingham and the Midlands, the collection that the museum has is fantastic.
Do you think that we care enough about things like that we want to retain? I know you do, and I know people who go, but do you think in general, do you think people bother about such things nowadays?
I think, well, the Heritage Lottery Fund have invested a lot of money into the commemorative 4 years. They've got a huge amount of money actually for groups, and they've already distributed quite a lot of that. So there are lots of groups who are really interested. Yeah, absolutely. I think the wider public are interested. You see the popularity of things like history programmes and Who Do You Think You Are, those sorts of things where people look back at their own family histories. I think absolutely people are interested.
I know there's quite a lot of still images. How much moving footage is there?
There is some. There are small bits and pieces. I think the Imperial War Museum in London probably has the biggest collection of film. So there are films that you can watch, and next year, 2016, is the 100th anniversary of a film that was shot about the Battle of the Somme. So the Imperial War Museum have this film. I think they'll be organising lots of screenings around the country.
Is there a change in attitudes over the years towards what happened then?
During the First World War? I think so, yeah. I think when you look back, again thinking about the legacy, I think the 1960s looked at it as a futile war. I think it's hard to see it, because of the Second World War coming so closely afterwards, it's hard to see it as a kind of independent event. I think now we're developing more understanding of what happened, and again the legacy and the impact of the war in the following years.
Because of course, called the Great War, and I imagine when the sigh of relief that must have gone up in 1918. Nobody could have thought that 21 years on they'd all be back to it again, would they? Yeah,
and I think yes, you're right. Obviously, there would have been a sense of relief, but there were so many problems that came immediately afterwards. You had men coming back. There was high unemployment. There were some riots in various cities, race riots as well in the following year. So again, I don't think it wasn't as if the war ended and everything was fine. I think there was another period of turbulence, and yes, obviously, the development was that it led to the Second World War.
Of course, yesterday actually marked the date in 1934 when Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany. Yeah. So again,
yes,
there were the warning signs, weren't there?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, as historians, we look back and you see these warning signs all the way along. And you can see relevance for today as well, and things that are happening.
And with hindsight, we all think, yes.
Yes, yeah.
People were probably less demanding in what they expected out of life then, weren't they, compared to, say, today?
Well, I think probably the class system was such that, if you were born into a particular class, then you would probably just expect to stay in that class. And there wouldn't have been the opportunities, for most people to, escape that, life of poverty if that's what they were in.
And presumably some of the men would think that going and signing up, I know it was all for king and country type of thing, but they would have probably thought it was better than the job they got already.
Absolutely, yeah, that's certainly true in many cases. I think you see in many young men, there's a real desperation. You know, their friends are joining up, they want to join up, they see it as an adventure. It's an opportunity to leave the country, to see different parts of the world. You know, they probably didn't realise what they were going into. But yes, certainly, you know, if they had some awful job that they wanted to escape, or no job, you know, it was a viable option, absolutely.
And whereas now, I mean, any wars, of course, are television wars, aren't they now?
Yes.
In those days, I mean, people wouldn't know for ages, would they?
Yes, that's the thing. There's a real delay in getting news back home. And things like letters obviously take a long time as well. And there are some really awful cases where there's one particularly I think there's some letters on display in the museum where the mother is desperate for news of her son. He's gone missing, and then eventually she finds out that he has been killed, but it takes such a long time, and she's sending lots of letters to him, which obviously he isn't receiving. So it's really sad to see those things.
And where was government and the armed forces then? They probably didn't give out as much information, did they?
No, absolutely not. And as I said earlier, things would be censored as well, so the soldiers couldn't, you know, they could only really talk about what was happening to them on a daily basis, but they couldn't talk about the wider conflict at all. So yeah, a lot of paranoia and a lot of secrecy.
Did people, when it all kicked off, think it was going to last for 4 years?
No, not at all. And I think it's sort of widely documented that they thought it would be over in a few months. They thought it would just be, you know, a small war, small conflict over in a few months. But it became quickly apparent that it wasn't going to be over by Christmas, as it were. But I'm not sure that they expected it to go on for the extent that it did.
I suppose with hindsight, you look at it now, and certainly in your role, you would not think, well, this is going to be over in a brief period of time.
No, absolutely not. And that's the beauty of hindsight, isn't it? That we can look back and sort of see things perhaps that we would think, oh, they shouldn't have done that, or they should have done something differently. Yes, it's very easy for us. So I think you really have to place yourself in their position and kind of see it from their point of view, which is quite hard to do.
Were you shocked at some of the things you found out?
Some of the things, yeah, they're yes, they are shocking. Even though, you know, we're obviously we see much more today, rolling news and things. But I think its personal stories are always really effective. So I worked for a time in Wolverhampton Archives, and they've got a fantastic collection of material that relates to a soldier who was from Wolverhampton and served in the trenches. And they have his small book, which was a book that soldiers were given when they enlisted, because obviously these guys didn't really know much about the army, so it told them how to cook their food and stuff. But this little book that has damage, there's a hole that goes all the way through the booklet, and it wasn't until I read some of the other material that I realised he'd been shot and killed. And this was bullet damage in this, you know, tiny little small book that actually anybody can go and see if they want to. It's in Wolverhampton Archives.
So that would have probably been in a breast pocket.
Possibly, yes, yeah. And you know, when you hold that in your hand, and you realise, you know, 100 years later, that's, you know, has a huge impact, I think, on anybody.
Do you become, doing the job you do you become anaesthetised to things like that or not?
I don't think so. No, I don't think it's possible. No, I think when you sort of, you know, when you read things and you hear things, and no, I think if anything, you become more affected by it, actually, sometimes, yeah.
Did we learn anything from that war?
That's a really difficult question. Probably not. I mean, you know.
I mean, it wasn't going to ever stop other wars, was it?
No, definitely not. You know, and it was a war of empires fighting out, you know, trying to carve up bits of the world. So I would suggest that probably no. You know, it did change lots of things, but whether we learned from it, I'm not sure.
And of course, lots changed. The aeroplane was coming into being, which of course was a whole part of World War II, wasn't it? And of course, they were still using horses, and you said they used dogs as well in the First World War.
Yes, I read an article a while back where they used dogs to send messages between the trenches, which is quite an interesting fact. But yes, they were certainly using animals, and that shows you, I think, the advances that happened during that conflict that were driven through because of the conflict.
Whenever I see images of World War One, I see men knee-deep in mud in trenches.
Yeah.
It can't always have been like that.
No, I mean, well, obviously, you know, they were there in the summer and the spring as well. And you sort of, you know, you do think of it as being very wet and cold and miserable, but obviously during the summer months it would have been just as tough on them, given that the uniforms they were wearing were very heavy. You know, and the smell would have been worse in the hot summer months as well. So yes, I don't think at any point during the year it was easier. I think it was just different challenges for them.
It's almost impossible sitting here to think what it must have been like in those trenches.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
I mean, there was it was every aspect of it was horrendous,
Yes,
wasn't it?
yeah, disease, being stuck there for long periods of time, illness, the food that they would have had, and they talk about the rats being, the size of cats and things like that. So yeah, it was horrendous. Yeah.
Were they able to bury their dead at all?
Well, I think a lot of the casualties would have been left on the battlefield. So obviously quite a lot, I don't know the statistics, but a lot of them perhaps would have never been identified or taken home to be buried. Yes, I mean, obviously that's a challenge. But there were things like the Friends Ambulance Unit and the medical units there were stretcher bearers who would have been there to take casualties away. But yes, it's quite a sort of difficult, it's another challenge that they had to think about.
Do academics have any big gaps in their knowledge of what went on in this war?
I think there's been a lot of academic work done on the First World War. I think there are areas that haven't been given perhaps as much attention. So we're learning, and perhaps that's by community groups as well, but we're also thinking more about soldiers from the Caribbean, soldiers from Africa, the Asian soldiers that came over and fought. A lot of people tend to think of it as just as trenches in Belgium, but obviously it happened in the Middle East and there was fighting in Africa as well. So I think there are lots of areas where perhaps we haven't focused on, and I think there is a lot that we can still learn, which is part of the reason that our centre has been set up. And to work with community groups as well, because community groups will bring a lot of knowledge as well that can benefit academics. So it's a bit of a two-way partnership there.
And because there was only a gap of 20 years, there have been quite a lot of people who would have lived through or been involved in the fighting of both the two main wars.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, they could never have foreseen, could they, that the first time that
No.
20 years, here we go again. Boys.
Yeah, and obviously that is the sort of turmoil that was happening in Germany post First World War. I guess politicians may have been aware of what was happening, but for your ordinary kind of working class soldier, But I think the two wars they're seen as very different conflicts, and it's almost. The Second World War is almost seen as a bit more heroic. There was more of a cause that people knew they were fighting, whereas this First World War, I think, still in some people's minds, it's a bit, why did we fight that war?
I suppose too the fact that Britain had a leader in a man like Churchill in the Second World War. There is nobody that you kind of identify and see. And, you talk World War II, Hitler, Churchill.
Yes, it's a different.
There wasn't that then, was there? Not in the same way.
No, the First World War is a bit harder, and I think obviously because more time has passed for us now. Again, it's harder. There isn't that one politician that we can hook it onto, or one kind of dictator, as it were. So yeah, it's a different conflict to deal with, but I think lots of scope to find out a lot more, and hopefully by the end of this commemorative period, we'll come away with a huge amount of knowledge that we didn't have 4 years ago.
Do any people know and saw the exhibition when it was on, and they've come to you and say, "Oh, I've got this, that was tucked away, that was my granddad's, or I've heard these stories"?
They haven't come to me personally, but I know that they have gone into archives. So in the Library of Birmingham, I think they have had people come in and have objects, yes, and letters and things that people have found. But that's again really interesting. There will be lots and lots of people around the country that will have personal collections, and they sort of hide them away in the attic, but actually they're really interesting for historians. So the more of that material we can access, the better.
How often when you're working on a project like this, Nicola, do you find out something and everybody goes, "Wow, we didn't know that, that's a first"?
Yeah, it does happen every now and then. I'm sort of racking my brains to think of examples.
Has there been anything this time that's cropped up?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I think it's just we're sort of building knowledge about lots of things. So we've done a series of events looking at certain areas to try and kind of increase our knowledge.
And what do we do with all this knowledge when we've got it?
Well, lots of projects will have gathered material which they can then deposit in archives. They may have creative websites which can then be archived with the British Library website, so that will be protected for the long term. All the material that's created or gathered can be archived or should be archived, and there's lots of websites as well that we can use, things like History Pin. There's lots of mechanisms for us to capture everything, which I think is a really important part of this, obviously, that we can access it later on.
And when the exhibition was on, did you get lots of schools coming?
Yes, yeah, there were quite a number of schools, and I worked particularly with Bourneville Infant School because they had some Heritage Lottery funding to do a project, and they came to see the exhibition, so they were really interested in what was happening down at Bourneville, the Cadbury family, and also they looked at their own family histories as well, and quite a lot of them had really interesting material, and some had medals and things that their grandfathers...
I was going to say, when you get groups like this going around there, do you go and stand at the back in disguise with your
Sometimes.
notepad and making notes?
Well, I quite like to.
Just to see what people are talking about.
Yes, yeah.
Because you pick up on the positives, and you also, I
Yes,
suppose, pick
yeah.
up on some
It's
negatives.
really interesting, yes, and you want to get feedback from people all the time as to what you're doing. And, you know, archive material can trigger memories for people as well, so that's really interesting. But it's really nice if you're with a school, you know, to get the kind of viewpoint of very young children is always really interesting.
Do you think that when the really young ones come, they identify with it more because it's kind of like, you know, the granddads were involved in it. It's not like looking back at battles in 1500 and whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting for me that Bourneville, they were year 2 pupils, so, you know, sort of 6, 7-year-olds, extremely young, and initially I thought, oh, they seem too young, you know, how will they be able to kind of make any sense of this? But they absolutely did. It was fantastic watching them. You know, they're just, when you show them archive photos of, you know, people working in factories, and there'll be young people working there as well, you know, they're just really interested in it. And then when they look back at their own family histories, as I mentioned, some of them had medals that their great-grandfathers or great-great-grandfathers had won, and there were letters, and so I think that's a brilliant way for them to access it.
Because they would go and see it, and then they'd go home and they'd tell mum and dad, and they'd say, oh, well, you know, next time you see your great-granddad, tell him this, and the stories would then come out.
Yeah, it was a very intergenerational project that Bourneville did, and I'm sure lots of other schools will do the same, where the children are talking to parents and then grandparents, and so they had an open day at the school. Lots of grandparents came, actually, and it was really nice to see, you know, the different generations talking about it.
Because I suppose traditionally you would expect that the people who come and look at this exhibition are of an older generation.
Yes, I mean, people who are interested in local history and family history do tend to be, you know, older people, but often they're retired, so they have time because it's quite a time-consuming hobby. But it was a real mixture, and again, I don't sort of have the statistics on the people that came to see that exhibition, but I think it was fairly broad, and, you know, often we would pop in and have a look, and there would be lots of young people there as well as older people. So.
Did it sort of stir your interest and imagination to want to look back at your family or people you know?
Well, I haven't had time to do that, but yes, I should do that. I think I think it was my great-grandfather on my mum's side, I think he was involved in some way, but I don't have the details. And on my father's side, I'm not so sure. But yes, at some point I should do some my own family research, yeah.
Because I mean, now when youngsters go around exhibitions and things, it's got to be touchy-feely, it's got to be hands-on, hasn't it? Were you able to provide that at all with something?
Well, in the
like
library, I mean, this was an exhibition that was on display in the Library of Birmingham, so they have, you know, a really nice exhibition space there. There were some interactive elements, but actually, I think in a subject like that, often archive material on its own, photographs, letters, I think we often think, you know, young people just want interactive stuff all the time, and actually that's probably not really true. So I think if you've got authentic material from the time, then that's irreplaceable, really.
And I suppose too, if they can see old letters with stamps on and spidery copperplate handwriting, there is an immediate sort of bond there, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's personal stories, and often, you know, it might be that the example is somebody that lived nearby them, or, you know, they can associate with it in some other way, but, you know, these are just ordinary people's stories, so I think everybody can identify with them.
Which is what you're looking for. And of course, prior to this, there was all the suffragettes, and that's been something else that you've done a lot of work with.
Yes, and I continue to work on that, actually. Yes, I did a project a couple of years ago with 2 local schools in Birmingham, where we looked at the Birmingham suffrage campaign, and we looked at both sides of the story. So lots of the girls that we worked with had sort of heard of the suffragettes and knew a bit about what they did, but they didn't know about the suffragists, who were the non-militant campaigners and were affiliated with the National Union of Women's Suffrage. So yes, we looked at the archive material, what was happening. There were lots of incidents in Birmingham and actually across the whole Midlands. Lots of campaigning, and then we made a short historical reenactment film with the girls, so they helped develop the script and they starred in it as well. So it was a really interesting subject to look at, and I've continued to look at it, actually. I'm really interested as a historical researcher into some of the women. We know about the Pankhursts and we know about Emily Davison and a lot of what happened in London, and there has been research done into the Midlands as well, but often these women, you know, we don't really know that much about them.
Did it make the girls want to vote?
They said yes. They were between sort of 13 to about 15. So they still have a few years to go. Yes, they said that it did. You know, we obviously asked them before and after the project had finished how they felt, and they said things that they thought it would be a waste not to use your vote, and they realised, you know, what these women had done to get it. So I'm hopeful that they will vote when it comes to it.
As you say, with your work on suffragettes, do you get angry when people don't vote?
I sort of respect people's rights. You know, it's their decision. Personally, I have always voted and would always vote, whether that's because I know perhaps more about the suffrage campaign than other people, I don't know. I think I always had in my mind that there were, you know, these women who had sacrificed things and fought to get the vote. So.
Yeah, and of course so many people, as you say, they know about Emmeline Pankhurst and the people who chained themselves to railings and ran across in front of horses and things. But there was another side to the campaign, very much, wasn't there?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there was the Suffragists. So you had this National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies that had been around for a long, long time and had made kind of slow progress, and that's partly one of the reasons the Women's Social and Political Union was founded by Emmeline Pankhurst, because they felt frustration at the campaign. But in Birmingham, there was a woman, Catherine Osler, who was head of the Birmingham Women's Suffrage Society and was a campaigner for many, many years. And these women, they were given far less press attention because what they did wasn't seen as being exciting, but they plugged away, and they continued to do it actually through the First World War as well. So they were extremely determined, but just less sensational, I guess.
The press has never changed then.
No.
And you've looked at children's lives as well, haven't you, across the Midlands?
This was
And I mean, that
project,
must have been a bit of an eye-opener at times as
well. Yes,
well.
it was really interesting. That was my first sort of involvement with the City Archives in Birmingham, and it was an exhibition and a website, which you can still access material on the website, about the lives of children. So we worked with a school again, we worked with two schools actually, into what life was like for children today, but we looked at all the historical archive material, and it was fascinating. And again, sort of relating to the First and Second World War, there's a lot of material about refugee children who came to Birmingham. So lots of Belgians came during the First World War, and Serbians and Austrians as well. And then in the Second World War, you have the Kinder transport children. So Birmingham, you know, always a sort of safe haven for refugees and people in trouble. But some of the archive material is fantastic, and a lot of it has been digitised, so you can look at it online.
Your degree was in the history of art, wasn't it?
Yes,
so,
yeah.
So history is clearly
Yes.
the number one thing. So was little
so.
Nicola always sitting there with history books
No,
when she was young?
not at all. I wasn't actually that interested when I was younger. I'm not sure what happened.
Yeah.
But yes, I think as I've got older, and I think I've become much more interested in social history and political history and the kind of how things are changed. And I think it's really important that we look back and see what people have done in the past to force change to come along.
Yeah.